London, 1852, a city alive with progress and decay, where the same fog that curled along the Thames seemed to seep through the soul of every man who walked its streets. Beneath its glittering advancements, a darker pulse beat quietly, morgues overflowing, pauper graves unearthed by night, the dead bought and sold for the price of knowledge. It was in this world that Dr. Nathaniel Ashcroft made his name. He was not a man of cruelty, nor one who took joy in the pain of others. His obsession was subtler, colder, a hunger not for death itself, but for mastery over it. To him, the body was a puzzle, divine in its complexity, and every dissection a conversation with God. Yet those who knew him spoke of a stillness in his presence, a vacancy behind his eyes, as though some essential warmth had been replaced by thought. At 37, Ashcroft was already a professor of anatomy at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, respected, feared, admired. His lectures drew crowds, his research won medals, but the man himself was a mystery. He lived alone in a narrow house on Montague Street, the upper floors crowded with specimens and books. His housekeeper claimed he spoke to no one except his cadavers. When he wasn't at the hospital, he was at home, bent over his desk beneath the green glow of lamplight, writing long into the night about the perfection of form and the imperfection of decay. For all his brilliance, he had known love only once. Her name was Elias Harrow, and she had been the daughter of a surgeon, beautiful, unafraid of the macabre, fascinated by his world. She would sometimes attend his lectures in secret, hidden among the students. They married quietly against her family's wishes, and for a brief time, his heart knew light. But in London, light rarely lasts. In the spring of 1849, cholera came like a biblical curse. It took her in a single night. One moment she was laughing over tea, the next she was coughing blood. He watched helplessly as her eyes dulled, her body convulsed, and by dawn she was gone. The doctor in him recorded her symptoms. The husband in him broke apart. He refused to bury her immediately. For 3 days, her body remained in the upstairs room, surrounded by flowers that withered faster than they should have. The neighbors whispered that he was trying to bring her back. The servants fled, saying the house stank of both perfume and death. When at last the coroner intervened, Ashcroft relented and allowed her to be taken. But in the darkness of that night, he followed the hearse to Highgate Cemetery and stood in the rain as the coffin was lowered into the earth. He did not weep. He watched the soil cover her and whispered something no one heard. After that night, he was never seen in daylight again. Years passed. The medical community spoke of his withdrawal, his vanishing from lectures, his absence from the journals he once dominated. They said grief had turned him mad, that he had become obsessed with the impossible, reversing death, perfecting beauty, fusing anatomy with divinity. But the truth was darker. In his house on Montague Street, he had begun a new experiment. It started with sketches, delicate charcoal drawings of hands, eyes, lips, each labeled with notes: ideal curvature, symmetry within 1/10 ratio, divine proportion. These drawings soon filled entire walls, until his study looked less like a laboratory and more like a shrine to an invisible woman. He called her Eve, not Evelyn, but something purer, untouched by illness or time. He began frequenting the dissecting rooms of the hospital after midnight, long after the students had gone. He told the attendants he was cataloguing tissue samples. They didn't question him. A man of his stature was not to be disturbed. What they didn't see was what he carried home under his cloak: fragments, remnants, small pieces of human perfection. At first, it was clinical. The curve of a hand preserved in alcohol, the iris of a particularly striking blue sealed in glass. But obsession knows no boundary once desire takes root. He told himself he was preserving beauty. In truth, he was collecting her, piece by piece. His home became a mausoleum of exquisite detail. Cabinets lined with jars, each labeled in his meticulous script. In the flicker of lamplight, the preserved eyes seemed almost to follow him. He began to speak to them softly, explaining his theories, convincing himself that through the art of reconstruction, he might restore what God had so cruelly taken. By winter, his notes had grown erratic. Pages filled with rambling equations, half poems, and sketches that blended anatomical precision with romantic idealism. He no longer sought life as a scientist, but as a lover seeks reunion. Evelyn's memory had ceased to be memory. It had become an instruction. Then one night, the grave robbers came. Every anatomist knew them, though few admitted it. Resurrection men, the thin line between academia and sin. They arrived at his door quietly, their faces hidden beneath scarves, their wagon waiting in the fog. One carried a sack, heavy and still damp with earth. Ashcroft met them with the calm of a man long expecting such company. He paid in sovereigns and asked only for freshness. The men left quickly, eager to be gone from the house that smelled of spirits and iron. Inside, he opened the sack with trembling hands. The woman inside had died young, perhaps 20, her features delicate even in death. To Ashcroft, she was not a corpse. She was a beginning. He recorded everything in his ledger. The texture of her skin, the symmetry of her bones, the faint resemblance to the one he had lost. He worked for hours, preserving, dissecting, studying. The air filled with the metallic scent of blood and formalin, the ticking of the clock marking his descent into something beyond science. Days blurred into nights. His journal entries became more fevered. Eve nears completion. The flesh resists the needle, but beauty endures. His sketches showed not diagrams but portraits, a composite of many women, a dream sculpted from fragments. The name Evelyn appeared less and less, replaced entirely by Eve. By spring he had constructed what he called the vessel. It lay upon his operating table, shrouded in linen, lifelike and still. Every feature matched his ideal of beauty, hair dark as wet soil, lips the faint color of rose dust. It was grotesque and divine, both corpse and creation. He spent hours beside it, adjusting, stitching, whispering. His hands, once steady from years of surgery, now trembled from exhaustion. The lamplight burned late into every night, the shadows on the walls shifting as though alive. One evening, as the fog pressed against the windows and rain tapped the glass, he sat beside her and felt something stir inside him. Not madness, but awe. He spoke to her softly, voice breaking, telling her that soon she would open her eyes again, that she would forgive him for taking so long. And as he spoke, something strange happened. The gaslight flickered. The still air in the room seemed to move. The faintest tremor passed through her fingers, so small he thought it imagined. He leaned closer, trembling, and the candle beside her flared. For a moment he swore she breathed. He wrote of it later in words almost illegible with excitement. Vital spark detected, pulse imperceptible but real. The experiment approaches culmination. To him, this was proof that love could conquer death, that the divine had not abandoned his intellect. To any other man, it would have been proof of madness. But Nathaniel Ashcroft was no longer any other man. He sealed the doors of his house, sent his housekeeper away with wages for a year, told the medical board he had taken ill. The curtains remained drawn, the air heavy with decay and lavender oil. Inside, he began the final phase of his work, not merely restoration, but animation. He scoured medical journals for theories on galvanism, the use of electricity to jolt life into dead flesh. He ordered copper coils, zinc plates, a voltaic battery imported from Italy. He wrote to no one. The neighbors began to talk again. Strange lights in the windows at night, the hum of machinery, the smell of burning metal. The local butcher swore he heard music playing faintly at 3 a.m., though no one had entered or left the house for weeks. Then one morning, the chimney stopped smoking. The light in the upper window went out and did not return. For several days there was silence. When the constable finally forced entry, the air inside was foul and still. The furniture was covered in a thin film of dust, except the table in the center of the room, which was spotless. Polished wood, surgical instruments arranged with obsessive precision. And on that table lay what at first looked like a woman sleeping. Only when the sheet was lifted, the constable who entered that house would never speak clearly of what he saw. He was an old man then, near retirement, used to London's grotesqueries. Suicides, drownings, the endless bodies dredged from the Thames. But when he emerged from Montague Street that morning, he was pale and shaking, his voice trembling as he told the inspector. She was smiling. The coroner arrived within the hour, followed by 2 assistants and a physician from St. Bartholomew's. They entered the study, with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, the air thick with the stench of decay and chemicals. The curtains were drawn, the fireplace long dead, the floor beneath the table stained dark with old fluids. And there she lay. At first glance, she might have passed for a sleeping woman. The face was peaceful, the lips slightly parted, the skin faintly flushed with color that should not have been there. Her hair, black and glossy, spilled across the table like a river of ink. But the longer they looked, the more the illusion fell apart. Her hands were mismatched in tone, her eyes of slightly different hues, her neck marked with the fine cross-stitch of thread. She was both perfect and impossible. One of the assistants vomited into the fireplace. The coroner, trembling, ordered that the remains be covered immediately. The moment the sheet touched her face, the air seemed to shift, as if the house itself exhaled. In the corner of the room sat a chair with restraints. Beside it, a copper battery rigged with wires and clamps. The metal smelled faintly of ozone. On a nearby table, notebooks lay open, their pages soaked in sweat and ink. The first few were diagrams, precise and clinical. But deeper within, the handwriting grew wild, a descent in ink. The inspector leafed through them with trembling fingers. There were notes about muscle conductivity, references to galvanic stimulation, philosophical arguments on the continuity of love and form. But interspersed among them were lines of something stranger. Eve listens when I speak. Her eyelids flutter as if the soul stirs. Love is the current. Flesh is only the wire. In the last entry, the handwriting was barely legible. The ink trailed downward as if the writer's hand had fallen away mid-sentence. It read simply, "She looked at me." They found Dr. Ashcroft upstairs. He was seated beside the window in his dressing gown, head tilted slightly to the side, eyes open. A wire coiled around his wrist led to the battery below. His right hand rested over his heart. His face bore neither pain nor peace, only wonder. He had died of electrocution. The copper plate beneath his chair was scorched black, the air around him tinged with the faint smell of singed hair and metal. The coroner ruled it an accident. The papers called it a tragedy of science, a brilliant man lost in his own experiment. But those who had entered the house spoke of something else. The woman on the table, they said, had not stiffened like an ordinary corpse. Her flesh remained pliant, her lips soft, her body unnervingly warm despite the cold room. And when they moved her to the stretcher, one man swore he saw her fingers twitch. They laughed it off as a trick of the nerves, post-mortem spasms, nothing more. Yet that night, one of the assistants returned alone to fetch the doctor's notes. He was young, curious, the kind who believed in discovery more than decency. He entered the silent house with a lantern, its light trembling against the walls. The scent of disinfectant hung heavy. He found the notebooks easily enough, stacked beside the copper coil. As he bent to gather them, he heard a sound, faint, almost like a sigh. He froze. The sound came again from the table. The sheet covering her face had shifted just slightly. He told himself it was air, or perhaps the settling of cloth. But when he took a step closer, the air turned colder. He leaned forward, heart pounding, and in the light of the lantern saw her chest rise. Only once. Then stillness again. He dropped the notebook and fled. By morning, the police had removed the body to the hospital morgue for examination. The young assistant never returned to St. Bartholomew's. He left London within the week, claiming illness, and was later found in a parish asylum, muttering that she had smiled when he ran. At the morgue, the coroner made his notes. Subject approximately 20 years of age, female, composite remains of at least 5 individuals, expertly assembled. Preservation extraordinary, signs of electrical trauma on left shoulder and breast. He did not record what happened next. During the autopsy, when the first incision was made, a faint vibration passed through the body. A shudder so brief that only the surgeon's assistant noticed. The surgeon dismissed it. But the moment his scalpel touched the heart, every lamp in the room flickered and died. When the lights were restored, the cadaver's eyes were open. The men in the room stood frozen. The coroner, pale as the dead, covered her face and ended the examination immediately. The body was sealed, labeled, and transferred to the hospital cellar for further study. It was never seen again. For weeks, London whispered of it. The press called it the Montague Street Horror. The penny dreadfuls printed lurid illustrations of the doctor and his bride. Sermons thundered against the sin of playing God. Scientists quietly called it an embarrassment, another scandal to stain the name of medical progress. But not everyone dismissed it. Among Ashcroft's papers, one letter stood apart from the rest, addressed but never sent, written in his clear, deliberate hand. It was to a colleague, Dr. Elias Mercer of Edinburgh, dated 2 weeks before his death. Elias, I have come closer than I ever dreamed. The vessel accepts the current, yet I fear the soul resists it. She wakes without memory in a shell of my love. Still in her eyes I glimpse recognition. It may yet be possible to recall her to herself. If I do not write again, you will know that I have joined her. Dr. Mercer, upon reading the letter, travelled to London to see for himself. But by then the house was sealed, the possessions auctioned, and the records filed away. Only one item was missing: the body itself. When Mercer inquired at the hospital, the clerk told him the specimen had been transferred to another facility for study. Which facility no one could recall. The paperwork had been signed, but the signature was illegible. For years afterward, strange rumors followed. A morgue attendant in Whitechapel claimed he saw a pale woman wandering the hospital corridors after midnight, barefoot and silent, her hair trailing behind her like smoke. A gravedigger swore he found fresh footprints near Evelyn Ashcroft's tomb after rain, small and feminine, pressed into the mud as though someone had stood there all night. And sometimes, when the wind carried through Montague Street, the old neighbors said they heard music again, faint, distant and slow, as if from an old gramophone. Dr. Mercer never stopped searching. He obtained what few pages of Ashcroft's notes he could find, studying them late into the night. They read like madness, mixtures of anatomy, poetry and devotion, but among them was one passage that chilled him more than all the rest. It was dated the night before Ashcroft's death. She opened her eyes tonight and spoke my name. Her voice was hollow, but it was hers. I felt her pulse beneath my hand, faint, fragile, alive. Tomorrow I shall give her the rest of me. The handwriting trailed into a jagged line, as though the pen had fallen mid-stroke. Mercer closed the notebook and locked it away, but he could not escape the image that haunted him. The anatomist seated beside his creation, wires coiled like wedding rings, the bride awakening to a world that had no place for her. In his later years, Mercer would write in his memoirs, Ashcroft did not die seeking to defy God. He died seeking to reunite with what he loved. But love stripped of soul becomes only hunger. And what he summoned that night, whatever flicker moved within that stitched-together beauty, was not Evelyn, but something born of his own obsession. For decades, London's medical community buried the scandal under silence. The Ashcroft case was omitted from textbooks. The body never recovered, the house eventually demolished. Yet whispers endured in the alleys near Montague Street. Children dared each other to peer through the old basement grates, claiming to see a woman's shadow beneath the cobblestones. And in the archives of St. Bartholomew's, a few old attendants swore that, on nights when the air turned cold and the lamps flickered for no reason, a faint hum could still be heard, like the pulse of an old bat. Years passed. London grew louder, brighter and more mechanical. The horse-drawn carriages gave way to clattering omnibuses. New buildings rose from the fog like cathedrals of progress. But beneath the engines of the modern world, the old city still lingered, its graveyards, its cellars, its ghosts. By the late 1870s, Dr. Nathaniel Ashcroft's name had nearly vanished from the memory of men. His books were out of print, his research quietly buried in the archives of St. Bartholomew's. To most, he was a footnote in a scandal best forgotten. But to a few, his story was legend. One of those few was Dr. Jonathan Vail. a young anatomist barely 30, brilliant and unsteady, who had grown up hearing whispers of the Montague Street horror. As a student, he had once found a single page of Ashcroft's notes in an old anatomy volume, a fragment describing the reclamation of form through electrical ascension. The handwriting was elegant, obsessive, and it fascinated him. By the time Vale took a teaching position at the newly founded University College Hospital, his fascination had hardened into purpose. He wanted to find the truth, to know whether the impossible story of the anatomist's bride had been madness or miracle. He began where all such obsessions begin, with the dead. The hospital's basement morgue was a cold warren of stone corridors, its air thick with formaldehyde and silence. It was here that Vale spent his nights, dissecting, sketching, and studying. His colleagues mocked him for his fascination with pre-galvanic theories, but he ignored them. The past, he believed, still held secrets worth exhuming. It was in that morgue that he first met Elias Harrow, a medical illustrator sent to catalogue preserved specimens. She was 26, practical, with the steady composure of someone accustomed to death. Yet there was warmth in her eyes, a lightness that seemed almost out of place among the jars of preserved flesh. They worked side by side for weeks. She drew. He spoke softly of anatomy, of the delicate poetry hidden in bones and sinew. At first she thought him eccentric. Then she noticed the reverence with which he handled the dead, as though he sought something within them that could not be found in the living. One night, while sketching the cross-section of a skull, she asked him why he spent so much time among corpses. He paused for a long while before answering. "Because they do not lie," he murmured. "Only the living pretend to be whole." After that, she began to sense the shadows beneath his brilliance. Weeks turned into months. Rumors spread that Dr. Vale was conducting unauthorized experiments, testing voltage on cadavers after midnight, stealing specimens from the teaching rooms. The staff whispered that he was trying to bring the dead to life. When the dean confronted him, he denied nothing. "I am only continuing a line of research neglected by cowards," he said coldly. The dean dismissed him at once. That night, Vale packed his notes and left the university for good. Eliza followed him. They rented a small house in Bloomsbury, not far from the old ruins of Montague Street. A coincidence that was not coincidence at all. The foundations of Ashcroft's demolished home lay buried beneath a newer building, its basement long sealed. But Vale knew. He had read the council records. He had seen the drawings of the old structure, and he knew what had once been hidden beneath it. He found the entrance after 3 nights of digging through the floor of his cellar. A brick archway leading into the darkness, sealed by dust and time. When he broke through, the air that rushed out was thick and cold, as if the place had been holding its breath for 30 years. Inside, he found remnants of the past. A rusted table, a shattered glass jar, the faint outline of burn marks along the stone, and in the corner, half buried beneath debris, a wooden crate bound with iron. He forced it open. Inside were papers, scorched, brittle, but legible. Notes written in the unmistakable hand of Nathaniel Ashcroft. He carried them upstairs and read by candlelight until dawn. The words were fragments of brilliance and madness, theology woven with anatomy. Ashcroft had not merely sought to resurrect life, he had sought to perfect it. To him, death was not an end, but an imperfection to be corrected. He wrote of Eve, the vessel through which the divine pattern might return. Vale was captivated. His admiration turned to reverence, then to something darker. He began repeating the experiments using equipment cobbled from scraps of copper, batteries, and induction coils. He wrote to foreign suppliers for chemicals and tissue preservatives. Eliza watched in silence as his hands grew unsteady, his speech fevered. She begged him to rest, to remember that the past had consumed greater men than he. But he only smiled and said, "Ashcroft began it. I will finish it." At first it was only theory. Galvanic experiments on small animals, tissue stimulation, nerve response. But soon he began acquiring human remains from the hospitals, paying attendance for unclaimed bodies. Each time he descended into the cellar, he carried with him both dread and hope, as though entering a chapel built for blasphemy. Eliza's sketches grew darker. Her hands trembled as she drew the outlines of what he was building, a form that began to resemble a woman. One night she found him seated before the table, staring at the body in silence. He had arranged it carefully, every limb precise, the skin pale as porcelain beneath the gaslight. It was incomplete, parts missing, the face half covered by linen, but even unfinished, it exuded a terrible grace. He turned to her and whispered, "Do you see it? Do you see what beauty truly means?" She tried to speak, but no words came. The sight of the form, and so delicate, so grotesque, struck her with equal horror and pity. It was as if the remnants of humanity itself had been sculpted into a question. From that night, she refused to enter the cellar again, but she heard him there, the hum of machinery, the hiss of gas, the occasional whisper that seemed to come not from his mouth but from someone answering him. Then came the night when the lights flickered through Bloomsbury. Neighbours reported seeing strange blue flashes in the windows, hearing the crack of thunder though the sky was clear. Some claimed they heard a woman's voice crying out, not in pain, but in awakening, when the constable arrived hours later. The door was open and the house silent. Inside, the air smelled of ozone and burnt cloth. The equipment was still humming. On the table, the linen was gone, and the form was complete. She was beautiful, too beautiful, like a dream sculpted by someone who had never seen a living woman. Her eyes were open, unblinking. Her lips, pale and soft, seemed ready to breathe. Dr. Jonathan Vale was nowhere to be found. Eliza was discovered upstairs, alive but delirious, whispering the same words over and over. She looked at me. She smiled at him. The newspapers resurrected the scandal. Another Montague Street horror, the headlines cried. The story spread through London like fever. A new anatomist following the steps of the old. The house was sealed by the police, its contents removed. Yet when the morgue attendants came to collect the body, it was gone. No sign of forced entry. No footprints, only the smell of burnt air and roses. Elias Harrow survived, though her mind did not. In the asylum at Hanwell, she spoke in riddles, drawing the same image again and again, a man standing beside a table, a woman rising behind him with her eyes closed. Months later, an anonymous letter reached the Times, written in elegant, educated script. It contained no name, only a single line. The work continues. She is not yet perfect, but she listens when I speak. The letter was signed. Simply, EA. At first, the editors dismissed it as a cruel hoax, a reference to the long-dead Dr. Ashcroft. But one of them, curious, visited Highgate Cemetery to see whether the original grave still stood. It did, yet the stone had cracked down the center, and the soil above it was newly disturbed. That night, the editor burned the letter. But he could not shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still working in the dark beneath London, stitching together the fragments of beauty left behind by death. In the years that followed, sightings continued. A pale woman seen walking along the Thames at dawn, her face hidden by a veil. Strange disappearances of unclaimed bodies from hospital vaults. Rumors of a secret society of anatomists devoted to the perfection of form. None of it could be proven. But in 1883, a fire broke out in the old St. Bartholomew's archives. When the flames were finally extinguished, nearly everything was lost. Records, letters, notebooks. Only one artifact survived, a small glass jar sealed tight, containing a single human eye suspended in clear fluid. The label had faded with time, but two letters remained legible, EA. The archivist who discovered it claimed the eye was still clear, the iris a striking, unnatural blue. Staring by the turn of the century, the story of the anatomist's bride had become a ghost that haunted the edges of London's medical world. Most dismissed it as folklore, a tale whispered by students over whiskey and candlelight. Yet for others it was more than myth, it was a challenge. In 1901, nearly 50 years after Nathaniel Ashcroft's death, a young academic named Dr. Henry Lavington came across a reference to the case while researching the history of anatomical ethics. The citation was simple: Ashcroft, N. Private Notes, Montague Street, 1852, restricted. But the term restricted drew him like a magnet. Lavington was not unlike the men who came before him, intelligent, ambitious, and quietly arrogant. He taught anatomy at King's College, a man of logic in a time of growing spiritualism. London was obsessed with seances, ectoplasm, and the ghosts of empire. But Lavington dismissed all such talk as sentimental superstition. To him, the only truth worth pursuing was the one written into flesh. When he requested access to the restricted notes, the archivist hesitated. "They're not medical records," the old man said. "They're something else," Lavington insisted. And after days of negotiation, he was led to a small back room in the archives, where the surviving remnants of Ashcroft's work were stored, blackened, fragile, but still breathing in their own way. Among the ash-smudged papers was a single envelope sealed with wax. Inside, he found a letter in Ashcroft's hand, addressed simply to "the heir of my work." The words were faint, but legible. "To whomever dares pursue what I began, know this: beauty is the shadow of the divine, and death its false veil. What I summoned was not abomination, but truth. The soul, once displaced, may yet return to the form it loves. Seek her, and she will find you." Lavington laughed aloud when he read it. The arrogance of a madman who had mistaken his own loneliness for revelation. But still he kept the letter, not out of belief, but fascination. Days turned to nights in the library. He studied every surviving scrap. Chemical recipes, diagrams of nerves, lists of names that might have belonged to the grave robbers who supplied Ashcroft. The details were erratic but brilliant, far beyond the crude experiments of his era. The longer he read, the more he began to wonder if the man had actually stumbled onto something extraordinary. Not resurrection, perhaps, but the reanimation of memory itself. Then, among the charred notes, he found a single photograph. It was old, printed on paper that had yellowed with age. The image showed a laboratory lit by gaslight, its details blurred by time. In the center stood a figure draped in linen. What caught his attention, though, was the face, faint, indistinct, but unmistakably feminine. Her eyes were open. Lavington could not sleep that night. He began visiting the hospital morgues, speaking to attendants, asking whether they'd ever heard of the Ashcroft woman. Most had not. But one elderly mortician claimed he'd seen something years ago, a body that refused decay, kept under lock in a private vault. She was beautiful, he whispered, eyes clouded by memory. But wrong. Too perfect, like marble pretending to breathe. He said the vault had been sealed by order of the hospital board, and that the key had been lost. Lavington found that story impossible to resist. He bribed a clerk for access to the old blueprints of St. Bartholomew's. What he found confirmed the mortician's claim. A sub-basement chamber beneath the pathology wing. Marked simply Archive 13 that night, he went alone. The air beneath the hospital was thick with dust and the hum of pipes. The deeper he descended, the more distant the world above became. When he reached the locked door of Archive 13, he found it rusted but intact. He pried it open with a crowbar, the sound echoing like thunder through the corridors. The room beyond was small, lined with shelves of forgotten specimens. Jars filled with organs, limbs, and preserved infants watched him through the fogged glass. But at the center of the room stood a large glass case covered by a sheet of canvas. He pulled it away and froze. Inside lay a woman. The body was impossibly well preserved. Her skin pale but unblemished, her hair still dark and lustrous. Her hands rested across her chest in perfect repose. The label beneath the case was faded, but he could make out 2 letters carved into the wood: EA. He stood there for a long time, unable to move. There was no smell of decay, no evidence of chemical treatment. She seemed asleep, caught between one breath and the next. When he finally tore himself away, he signed the entry log as researcher Lavington and left. But he returned the next night, and the next. Each time he stayed longer. He began sketching her features, noting the symmetry, the impossible perfection of her form. He told himself it was for science, a study of preservation, but in his notes the tone shifted from observation to intimacy. He wrote of the calm intelligence of her expression, the grace of her hands. He began referring to her as Eve. He spoke to her softly as he worked, his voice echoing in the chamber. He imagined she listened. Weeks passed. His colleagues noticed his absence from lectures, his distracted gaze. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. The only light in his rooms came from the oil lamp he carried back and forth between the hospital and his home. Then, one morning, the night porter at St. Bartholomew's found him asleep beside the glass case. His hand pressed against the surface, his breath fogging the glass. When woken, he stared at the man and whispered, "She moved." They laughed at him, of course. They thought he'd lost his mind, but that night he returned again, desperate to prove what he'd seen. He set up a galvanic battery, rigged wires from the terminal to the glass, and fed the current into the air around her. The hum filled the vault like a heartbeat. Nothing happened. He increased the current. The lamps flickered. Still nothing. In frustration, he pressed his hand against the glass again and shouted her name. The electricity arced, striking his wrist, searing his flesh. He fell back, the light exploding around him. And then, for a heartbeat, he thought he saw her fingers curl. The shock burned his skin, but he felt nothing but elation. He knew what he must do. The next morning, the hospital matron found the sub-basement flooded with smoke. The glass case was shattered. The air reeked of ozone and blood. Dr. Henry Lavington lay dead beside the wreckage, his eyes wide, a smile frozen on his face, and the body inside the case was gone. The investigation was brief. The official report listed it as an electrical accident. The vault was sealed, the remaining specimens destroyed. But those who carried out the cleanup told another story. One porter claimed he found footprints on the wet stone floor, small, bare, and leading not to the stairs, but toward a drainage tunnel. Another swore he saw a woman's figure standing in the far end of the corridor, pale and silent, watching them as they worked. The hospital denied everything, but a month later, a fisherman on the Thames pulled from the water what he thought was a drowned woman. When the body was hauled aboard, the crew recoiled. She looked untouched by death, her skin white as wax, her eyes open and glassy. Before they could reach the docks, the tide shifted and the current swept her overboard again. The newspapers made little of it. Another anonymous corpse, another mystery lost to the river. But in the corners of London where whispers thrive, the story spread. The bride had returned. Some said she wandered the docks barefoot, seeking the man who made her. Others claimed she appeared in morgues when the lamps went out, her reflection visible only in the metal of surgical instruments. And in one private museum near Bloomsbury, a night watchman reported that the preserved specimens had begun to cloud. All except one, a heart in a glass jar that pulsed faintly when the clock struck 3. When the museum curator examined it the next morning, he found a new label affixed in careful handwriting, EA, perfected. The legend of the anatomist's bride became a story told in low voices, a warning to those who studied too closely the mysteries of flesh. But in forgotten rooms and locked basements, there were always a few who listened, who wondered, who dreamed of touching what Ashcroft, Vale, and Lavington had pursued for beauty, once glimpsed through the veil of death, becomes an infection of the soul. And by the time the 20th century staggered into its middle age, London had changed again. The soot had thinned, the gas lamps replaced by electric light, the graveyards built over by schools and offices. The city no longer believed in ghosts. But ghosts, of course, do not ask for belief. They endure, quietly, in the things we forget to fear. In 1951, during the reconstruction of the old pathology wing at St. Bartholomew's, workers uncovered a sealed chamber behind a brick wall. The foreman assumed it was part of an older foundation, until his men pried open the door and found themselves staring into the dark mouth of the past. The air that escaped was heavy and cold, untouched for decades. Inside, the walls were lined with rusted cabinets, On the floor lay the remnants of shattered glass, copper wire, and the collapsed skeleton of what had once been a galvanic machine. They found papers too, brittle, water-stained, nearly unreadable. Most disintegrated at a touch, but one folder sealed in wax survived. The name written on it was Dr. Henry Lavington. The university archivists took the discovery as a historical curiosity. They cleaned what they could, catalogued the fragments, and placed them in storage. Only one man, a young researcher named Dr. Samuel Cartwright, seemed truly interested. Cartwright was not a romantic like Ashcroft, nor a visionary like Vale. He was a forensic pathologist, clinical, skeptical, and fascinated by the way science and myth sometimes collided in the dark corners of history. The Ashcroft case had always intrigued him, a story of love, death, and obsession passed from one generation of anatomists to the next, each claiming to bring the impossible closer to life. When he studied Lavington's recovered notes, he found references to something called the EA specimen. The language was clinical, but the tone carried a strange reverence. Lavington wrote of a biological anomaly preserved in near-perfect condition, exhibiting non-standard post-mortem integrity. The last line of his final entry read, "She has begun to change." Cartwright assumed it meant decomposition. Yet the phrasing bothered him. It suggested not decay, but transformation. He requested permission to examine the materials in person. The archivists, tired of the sensationalist interest surrounding the old case, reluctantly agreed. They led him into the sub-basement where the remnants of the collection were kept. A concrete room with a single flickering light and the constant hum of refrigeration units. Most of the artifacts were unremarkable, but at the far end of the room, behind a thick pane of reinforced glass, stood an old specimen jar. Inside was a human heart. It floated in pale liquid, the tissue perfectly preserved, veins faintly visible beneath the surface. A small brass label on the base bore the inscription, EA, Gnome 13. Cartwright leaned closer. The heart looked freshly excised, not a century old. He examined it through the glass for several minutes, noting the faint irregularities, the subtle mottling of the tissue, the perfect symmetry of the chambers. And then he saw something else, a tremor, so slight he thought it a trick of the eye. The faintest ripple through the fluid, as if the heart had shuddered. He stepped back, blinking. The surface of the liquid was still again, unbroken. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. He checked his watch, made a note, and left. That night, he dreamed of her. A woman standing in a room of cold light, her face pale, her eyes colorless. She did not speak. She simply lifted her hand, and in that hand something pulsed. A heart, still beating, gleaming wet and red. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat. In the following days, Cartwright's behavior changed. His colleagues noticed his growing agitation, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he lingered in the archives long after closing. He began writing obsessively, half research notes, half something else. He compared Lavington's recovered notes to modern medical data, charting impossible parallels. The EA specimen, he realized, had survived a century without decay. No known preservation technique could account for it. Not formalin, not glycerin, not vacuum sealing. Something else was keeping it intact. He began running quiet tests, temperature readings, spectral scans, tissue imaging. The results were inconsistent. Sometimes the tissue registered as organic, sometimes synthetic. Once the monitor flashed with a trace pulse signal, a phantom heartbeat. His assistant, a postgraduate named Miriam Lowe, thought it was an equipment error. "It's a century-old organ," she said with a nervous laugh. "If it's still beating, I'm quitting." Cartwright didn't laugh. He returned alone that night, determined to test it again. He brought a portable monitor and attached the sensors through the glass. The heartbeat pattern returned, faint but steady, a rhythm like the echo of something sleeping. He increased the sensitivity. The pulse quickened, and then the lights went out. The sudden darkness swallowed the room. The hum of the refrigerators died. He fumbled for his flashlight, heart hammering. The beam cut through the black, landing on the glass jar. The fluid inside shimmered faintly, like the reflection of moonlight on water. He leaned closer, The heart was gone. The jar was empty. The beam of his flashlight trembled. He looked down and saw the fluid spreading across the floor, glistening under the light. The glass was unbroken. The liquid had seeped through as if the barrier had never been there. Something cold brushed his wrist. He turned, the flashlight shaking in his hand. The beam caught a glimpse of a figure standing just beyond the glass. A woman, her face obscured by shadow, her skin pale as marble. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Then she was gone. The lights returned. The hum resumed. The jar was intact again, the heart floating where it had been, perfectly still. Cartwright fell to his knees, breathless. He checked his pulse monitor. The line still blinked, a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat exactly. In the weeks that followed, his colleagues noticed he had changed further. He spoke little, ate less, and began to wear gloves at all times. His skin had grown pale. His eyes looked unfocused, like a man listening to something no one else could hear. Miriam found his notebook on his desk one night. The final pages were written in a frantic scrawl. The connection is real. I feel her pulse in my veins. She is within the current, the charge, the blood. She never died. She only moved between bodies. Ashcroft built her form. Vale awakened her. Lavington freed her. I have become her echo. The entries ended abruptly. The next morning, Cartwright was missing. His apartment was empty, his clothes neatly folded on the chair. The only thing left on the desk was the brass label from the specimen jar, EA, Gnome 13. The jar itself was gone. Police searched for weeks but found nothing. Then, 2 months later, a cleaner at King's College reported a strange smell in the pathology lab. When she entered, she found a pool of clear liquid on the floor and a faint residue clinging to the wall, like the outline of a human body pressed into the plaster. Tests revealed nothing organic. The stain resisted all cleaning, faintly luminescent under light. It was sealed behind a panel and forgotten. But sometimes, when students stayed late in the labs, they swore they could hear the faint rhythm of a heartbeat coming from the wall. And if they stayed long enough, a woman's shadow would flicker across the glass of the specimen jars, graceful, silent, and watching. In time, the legend of EA evolved once more. Some said she was not a ghost at all, but an idea. The embodiment of human arrogance, born from men who loved their own intellect more than life. Others whispered that she was still alive, moving through the generations, inhabiting those who dared to study her too closely. The Ashcroft case became a lesson taught to new medical students, a parable about the dangers of obsession. But there were always a few who didn't see it as warning, who saw it as invitation. In a private lab in Cambridge, a historian of medicine cataloguing recovered specimens recently came across a sealed crate labeled Montague Street, 1852, property of St. Bartholomew's. Inside was a small glass container. The label read simply EA, sample number 14. When she lifted it to the light, she swore she saw something move inside. Not the twitch of tissue, but the faint shimmer of an iris looking back. She sealed the crate and sent it to storage. But later that night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, she returned to the basement. The crate was empty, and somewhere, perhaps in the veins of the city itself, beneath the lights and the hum of electricity, something continued to pulse, slow, patient, eternal. It no longer belonged to Ashcroft, or Vale, or Lavington, or Cartwright. It belonged to the thing they had made. She had no grave, no name the living could speak. Only the letters they gave her, EA. Those who know the story never agree on what they stand for. Evelyn Ashcroft, Electric Ascension, Eternal Anatomy, but perhaps it means something simpler.